Good morning, everybody. So we are starting today from Daf Chaf Aleph Amud Base 21b in the Yatros 21b2, and in the main it's about halfway down the page. It starts with a section from the Mishnah B'Sheni Uv'Chamishi B'Shabbos B'Mincha Keren Shleisha, that on all these times on Monday, Thursday, and Shabbos afternoon we call up three, and this is where the Gemara is going to pick up from. Okay, says the Gemara. Although we started this yesterday, but I'm just going back a little bit to begin from a break in the Gemara. So, Hani Shleisha Keneged me, these three people that we call up on Mondays and Thursdays and on Shabbos afternoon. Why do we call up three? In other words, what's the symbolism behind it? What do they correspond to? Reb Asi says, Keneged Torah Nevi'im Uksuvim, corresponds to the three sections of the Torah. You have Torah, you have the books of the prophets, and then you have the books of the writings. So that's why we call up three people to read from the Torah. Rava says, Keneged Koyanim Leviim Yisraelim. It corresponds to the three groups of Jews, and they are the priests, the Levites, and the Israelites. So that's why we have three people that are called up on these days. So the Gemara asks, Elahod, the Tanya Reb Shimi, that which was taught in a brisa by Reb Shimi, Ein Pechasin Miyut Psukim, Bebeis HaKnesses, that when we read in a synagogue, it should never be less than 10 verses. So the question is, what do these 10 verses correspond to? Now, before we get to ask that question, we continue in the brisa that we're quoting, which tells us that it's true. You need to have 10 verses when you read from the Torah. In other words, we will never open up a Torah to read from it at any time if there are less than 10 psukim to be read. It's always at least 10. So let's say you're reading on a Shabbos afternoon, you'll count each time they open up the Torah, right? You'll see that there are at least 10 verses that are divided between these three people that are called up. There's always 10. Now, Tosfos at the bottom of the page points out that there is one exception. There's only one exception to this rule, and that exception is on Purim, because on Purim we read the story of Amalek that is in the book of Exodus at the end of Parshas B'Shalach, and there, if you count the verses, you'll find that there are only 9 verses. But that's the only exception to this rule. But the rule otherwise is that there are always 10. So when we say that there needs to be 10 verses, the Brisa tells us, Vayidaber. We know that many sections of the Torah start with Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe Aleima, God spoke to Moses saying, right? Which is kind of a introduction to the passage. But nevertheless, this pasuk, this verse, Vayidaber Oile Min HaMinyan, that is included in the counting of 10 verses. So now the Gemara asks, Hani Asoro, these 10 verses Keneged me. Who do they correspond to? In other words, if you're telling me the symbolism in the three people who are being called up, what's the symbolism in the 10 verses that are the minimum requirement to be read? Amr Shmuel Levi says, they correspond to the 10 unoccupied men of the synagogue. As we learned earlier in the tractate, in the Gemara, it says that in order to be considered a city, a proper city, you have to have at least 10 unoccupied men who are available in the synagogue, either to make a minyan or to deal with communal matters. But the point is that they are being supported to be free to be in the synagogue anytime they are needed, right? So corresponding to those 10
Can
people.
I have just a clarification as since I'm an idler, because I don't work any longer, that
Right.
I'm not regarded as being lazy, just being available to do, let's say, a mitzvah by being there at shul, right?
Right.
So it's not a negative thing, it's just that you're not working.
That's correct. That's correct.
Okay.
In this
Just
case,
want to make sure.
it's one of the few times where the term batlanim is not used in a negative term, but rather in a positive sense, that they are free to be able to occupy themselves with mitzvahs in the shul. Okay, so that's why we have 10 verses. Rav Yosef says that there's actually another thing that it corresponds to, and that is Keneged Aseret Sadibros Shenemru LaMoshe B'Sinai. They correspond to the 10 commandments that were sent to Moshe at Har Sinai. Okay, another suggestion is Rav Levi Amar. Rav Levi says Keneged Asara Hilulim Shama David B'Sefer Tehillim. They correspond to the 10 phrases said by David in the Tehillim. So this refers to the last few Psalms. They start with Hallelujah and they end with Hallelujah. So if you count them all up, you'll find that there are 10 times where it has this Hallelujah. So now Rabbi Yochanan says they're actually Keneged Asara Mamoros Shebahen Nivra Ha'olam. They correspond to the 10 divine utterances with which the world was created. We know that Hashem created the world with his speech, so to speak, right? And where do these divine utterances appear? They appear at the beginning of Bereshis, where it says, "Vayom Elokim," and Hashem said, "Yehi or," let there be light. And then there are all the other sayings where God says, "Let the earth bring forth vegetation." So each time you have 10 different utterances with which Hashem created the world. So the Gemara asks, "Hi Nihu," which are the 10 utterances? So he says, "Vayom de Bereshis," the phrases, and God said that appear in the portion of Bereshis. So the Gemara asks, if you go there and you look carefully, you'll count and you'll find that there are only 9. There aren't 10, there are only 9. So the Gemara, Hani Tishahavu, these are only 9. Gemara answers, Bereshis Nami Maimahu. When it says in the verse, Bereshis Bara Lekin, Eis Hashamayim ve'Eis Aretz. In the beginning, Hashem created the heavens and the earth. So this verse, this Bereshis, is also considered to be a creative utterance from Hashem. Dichsiv, like it says in Tehillim, B'dvar Hashem Shamayim Nasu Uvruach Piv Kol Tzavam, that by the word of Hashem the heavens were made, and by the breath of His mouth all their hosts. So we see that it must have been with the utterance of Hashem that the heavens were created. So when we say Bereshis, that must be the utterance, because in that verse it talks about the creation of the heaven and the earth. And since we don't find any other place where it says any other utterance, so it must be that the Bereshis Bara Elokim, that itself was considered to be the utterance. Okay, so this is where we got up to yesterday, and here we're going to move a little bit further. And
Rabbi?
Yes.
I'm sorry. I've been out for a few days because I'm in the middle of a COVID attack here.
Okay.
My wife and I both are laid up. Where are we up to?
We are holding towards the bottom of Chaf Aleph Amud Beis, Amar Rava. It's just 4 lines before the big wide lines. So there's the wide lines and then the big wide lines. So it's 4 lines before the big wide lines. Amar Rava. So you got it? Okay. So I think this is a good place to stop and to give a little bit of an introduction to what's coming shortly. Okay. There are a few rules you need to know about reading the Torah. With regards to how we divide the psukim, okay? Each person that gets called up to the Torah has to read at least 3 verses, okay? They have to read at least 3 psukim. Less than 3 psukim, we're not going to call you up. Now, these 3 psukim need to be in a particular portion. Now, what do I mean by portion? So I'm going to share with you right now, because it's going to come up soon in the Gemara. It's not going to come up immediately. It's going to come up soon, but it's important, and not important, but it's worthwhile to understand this ahead of time. So do you see what I've shared on the screen?
Yes.
I have in front of me the reading for Rosh Chodesh, okay? This is from Parshas Pinchas, and this is the way it looks in the Torah, okay? So now you'll notice, from verse 1 until verse 8, that is considered a Parsha, okay? That is considered a parsha. What is the parsha? It's a portion which talks about the daily sacrifices in the Mishkan and subsequently in the temple. Okay, the one that's brought in the morning, the one that's brought in the afternoon. That's one parsha. Now look at verse 9. Verse 9, as you can see, it starts like its own section. And this section has 2 verses. And it's a section which talks about Shabbos, the sacrifices that are brought on Shabbos. Ubayom Shabbos, on Shabbos, Shnei Kvasim, 2 sheep, etc. And then it finishes Veniska. So there's only 2 verses. So here you have an example of a parsha, that only has 2 verses in it, and it's called a parsha. Then, as we move along, you've got from verse 11 till the end of verse 15, the portion of Rosh Chodesh. This is where we start to read about Rosh Chodesh. Okay, it starts with Rosh Chodshechem and talks about the sacrifices that are brought on Rosh Chodesh until Veniskoi. That's the end of the parsha, and therefore you see a break. And then it starts with Vachodesh Harishon, which starts talking about sacrifices of Pesach. Okay, so far so good.
No,
Yeah.
why doesn't Pasuk 8 end with Nischa?
Well, why?
Because the others are ending with Nischa.
Okay, okay, it's a good question, but it's the way the Torah writes it. I'm not sure why it doesn't finish off
Okay.
with Veniska. So the bottom line is, again, let's go over this. 8 psukim, end of the parsha. 2 psukim, end of the parsha. Another 5 psukim, end of the parsha. So now, here's what I want to try and explain. The first guy who gets called up to the Torah has to read 3 psukim, at least 3 psukim. Yes? You have to read 3 psukim. No problem. The next one also has to read 3 psukim. Also no problem, right? So you got 1, 2, 3, then you got 4, 5, 6. But now the last guy who's got 7 and 8 would only have 2 psukim, right? That's a problem. And not just that. There's another issue, which is we don't like to end within 3 verses from the end of the parsha. Which means I don't want to finish off at the end of verse 6 and then only leave me 7 and 8 in that parsha. What I want to do is I want to at least finish at the end of verse 5, so I've left 6, 7, and 8 still in the parsha, okay? Because otherwise it leaves things hanging, and we don't want to leave things hanging, okay? We don't want to leave.
Why can't you read the 2 first parashot up to 10?
No, but what I'm saying is, if I want to divide, if you're reading it, if one person's reading it, you're right, there's no problem. If one person's reading, you can read all the way through. You've got enough psukim. I'm talking about if I want to divide it up. The question is, how do I divide it? If anybody goes to a shul where they have the minhag to add aliyot, right? Where they add when they have more people to call up. So the Baal Korah usually has a hard time figuring out where can I stop and where can I not stop. And people think, well, just stop anywhere. No, you can't just stop anywhere. There are rules. You can't just stop anywhere. You cannot stop within 3 verses to the end of the particular portion, right? So, like I said, 1 till 8 is a portion, right? You cannot stop within 3 verses. You've got to leave at least 3 verses to the end of the parsha, okay? And then likewise, Ubayom Shabbos, right? I can't just read Ubayom Shabbos on its own because that's only 2 verses. I need to have an extra verse, right? And so this is going to be what the Gemara is going to be discussing about dividing up the reading of the Torah. Okay, now I want to leave some of this for the actual Gemara when we learn it inside. I'll bring it back up again, but I wanted to just give you a little bit of a taste of what we're talking about so that you can understand what's coming in the Gemara. Okay, I'm going to stop here unless there are any questions. I'm going to just go back to the text. I'm just going to go
Rabbi,
back.
I'm sorry, I came in a little bit late, but we're talking about what, the Rosh Chodesh readings?
We're talking about in general. We're talking about in general when you read on Monday or Thursday or Shabbos Mincha, there at least has to be 10 verses that are read. And I just use this reading of Rosh Chodesh because that's what's going to be referred to later on in the Gemara. And I showed the concept of the challenge of how we divide up the verses. It has to be at least 3 verses, and it cannot end within three verses of the end, and it can't just be 2 verses, right? And so we're going to try to figure out how to divide them all up. So
I have a question before that. If you want to finish, go ahead. But I want.
No, it's okay. You can ask now because we're going to do the Gemara inside.
I wanted to say it says here in the Bet Knesset when they read from Mincha in the Bet Knesset.
Okay.
What about when people have a Torah in the house? I see sometimes people bring the Torah to their house.
Well, so what they're doing is they're transforming their house into a base Knesset because the idea here is that you have a minyan. Yeah, the idea is that you have a minyan and that you're reading, because look, generally speaking, we talk about things the way they're normally practiced. You know, there are times, for example, if you have a base ovel, so the house of a mourner, so they will, you know, convert the house into some sort of a synagogue to be able to do the tefillot, the prayers over there. Okay, let's go inside and let's look at the next Gemara. Okay, so, Amar Rava. Rava says, Rishon Shekara Dalet Meshubah. If the first guy who gets called up to read from the Torah reads 4 verses, which means you've got 4 plus 3 plus 3. We said it's never less than 10 verses. So how are you going to split up 10 verses? You're going to have 4, 3, and 3. That's how you get 10. So if the first guy reads 4, then he's praiseworthy. What happens if it was different? It was Sheni Shekara Dalet Meshubach. If the second reader reads 4 verses, he's praiseworthy. In other words, if the first guy, for example, read 3 verses and the second guy reads 4 verses, so he's praiseworthy. Let me just finish and I'll explain what's going on. Shlishi Shekara Dalet Meshubach. If the third reader reads 4 verses, he's praiseworthy. But what we're really trying to say is that if anybody reads an extra verse, right, he's praiseworthy. Remember, today it's fixed what we read, but in those days it wasn't necessarily fixed. It wasn't you know, a text that you had to follow, right? You just read the parsha of the week, right? And you could read as many psukim as you want, because remember, it wasn't just one bal koreh, it wasn't just one person reading. There were any person that got called up, he would read from the Torah. So if a guy gets the honor to come up and read, and instead of reading 4 verses, he reads instead of reading 3 verses, he reads 4 verses. We're saying he's praiseworthy. Okay, you don't have to just read 3. If you read 4, it's fine, and it's praiseworthy.
Nobody had chumashim.
Right.
Nobody was sitting there checking and counting.
Well, in those days, they were aware of the breaks. Right. I mean, you're talking about people who were familiar.
And also, don't we go back a pasuk to?
We're gonna get there. We're gonna get there. The Gemara's gonna deal with it.
Where are you in the?
Okay,
Gemara?
So we are Daf Chaf Aleph Amud Beis, and we are 3 lines, 3 lines from the big wide lines.
Wow. Okay.
Okay, we just said Rava Amar Rava Rishon Shekara Daled Meshubach. The first guy read 4 verses, he's praiseworthy. Sheni Shekara Daled Meshubach. Second guy reads 4, he's praiseworthy. Shlishi Shekara Daled Meshubach. If the third guy reads 4 verses, he's praiseworthy. So now we're going to bring a source to show why each one of these aliyahs are prominent aliyahs. In other words, if you think that if your aliyah is prominent, you'll find a source for it that it is prominent. Rishon, how do we know the first one is prominent? Rishon Shekara Daled Meshubach. When we say that the first reader reads 4, he's praiseworthy. The Tanan, because we've learned in a Mishnah That with 3 baskets of 3 sa'ah, that's the size each. Which they make the withdrawal from the chamber. And it was written on these containers, Aleph, Base, and Gimel. So what's this talking about? This is talking about Machzis HaShekel, that the Jewish people were all required to give Machzis HaShekel, and this Machzis HaShekel would go to pay towards the sacrifices, and they would withdraw from it 3 times a year, right? So now, on these boxes, which they would use to collect these funds, the first box had the letter Aleph, the second box had the letter Base, and the third box had the letter Gimel. Why did they need to have letters on these boxes? It's not as if they were different amounts. It's not like quarters, nickels, and dimes. It's all half a shekel. So what's the difference whether it's box 1, 2, or 3? Says the Gemara, says the Mishnah, Leida Ezamahem. It's to know which box was filled first. In other words, which box received the first donations, in order to be able to use those funds for the sacrifices first. Because it's preferable to use the first one for this mitzvah, to pay for the sacrifices. So what do you see from here? We see from this Mishnah that the first is the most prominent. Okay. So now, if the middle one, meaning the second guy who gets called up, we're talking about on a Monday, a Thursday, or a Shabbos, where you only get 3 called up. So if the third one is last and the first one is second, the first one is first. So then the middle is number 2. So we're calling him the middle, right? So how do we know the middle guy is a prominent aliyah? So if the middle one reads, he's praiseworthy, the Tanya, because it says with regards to the menorah, it says that the lamp shall shine towards the face of the menorah. Now, I need to explain something. Okay, you have the Beis Hamikdash. Okay, the Beis Hamikdash had. I should have drawn it, but okay, I'll just draw it over here quickly. Just give me a second. Okay, so let's. Can you see? No, it's not going to work. Okay, doesn't matter. I'll explain. You have the Kodesh, HaKadoshim, and then you have the Azara, right? So let's say the Kodesh HaKadoshim is all the way in the front. Okay, it's all the way in the front. Then you have the Kodesh, which is in front of that, and in the Kodesh you would have the menorah. Now there are 2 opinions, at least 2 opinions of which way the menorah was facing. Was the menorah facing towards, like this way, like towards the Kodesh HaKadoshim, or was it like this, like parallel? Was it horizontal or perpendicular? So according to the opinion that it was horizontal, right? According to the opinion that it was horizontal, then this is what ends up happening. You have 7 branches of the menorah, 3 on each side and 1 in the middle. The 3 on each side, the wicks are all faced towards the middle. Okay, they're all faced towards the middle. So those on the right face towards the middle, and so their wick is towards this way, the others towards this way. The only one that was faced towards the Kodesh HaKadoshim was the middle one. The middle one was faced towards the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Okay, so when it says Amol Pnei HaMenorah Ya'iru, it teaches us Melamed Shemitzadet Pneihem Klape Ner HaMaravi. This teaches that the Kohen makes the wicks of 6 lamps face towards the western lamp, right, which is the middle one. The Ner Maravi, and the western lamp Klape Shechina, its wick would face towards the Kodesh HaKadoshim, towards the Shechina, right? And Rabbi Yechanan said, we see from here that the middle one is praiseworthy. In other words, the middle one has this special distinction, right? That it faces towards the Kodesh HaKadoshim, and all the others face towards it. And so therefore, this is a source that the middle, the one who gets called up middle is praiseworthy. So if he wants to read 4 more than the others, right? If he wants to read a verse more than others, or himself just read 4, it's praiseworthy and it's appropriate. Okay, so now the Gemara says about the last one is the last one, meaning the third one who reads 4, he's also praiseworthy, we say. Why? Mishom, because we have a principle, Mailin Bakodesh V'Lemeridin. We like to ascend in holiness. We don't want to descend. So if somebody read 3, it's appropriate for the last guy to read 4, to go up in holiness, right? And so if Kohen is one level, and then we move on to Levi, so we're going to go up in holiness, and then we go to Shlishi, which is the Yisrael. We're saying, as we go in the reading of the Torah, we want to add in holiness. The way we're going to add in holiness over here is by adding an extra verse. Okay, so now we have a story. Stories are the best because they show us, appropriate conduct. It's one thing to talk about it in theory. It's another thing to talk about it in practice. So we say over here a story. Rav Papa Ikla Labei Kenishta da Avigai. Rav Papa came to the synagogue of Avigai. Kora Rishon Arba, and he read the first 4 verses. In other words, he got called up first. I suppose he was a Kohen. And he read 4 verses. Shabche Rav Papa, and Rav Papa praised him.
Who decides that you can read 4?
Excuse me, I take this back. Rav Papa came, and the guy who got called up, Kohen, read 4 verses, and Rav Papa praised him. Okay, that's what happened. Not Rav Papa got called up, but the Kohen who got called up, he read 4, and Rav Papa was very happy with that, and he praised him. Okay?
But Rabbi,
yes,
you just said that the last guy should read 4. So if this is an example of that explanation, then you can't say that he was a Kohen. He had to be a Shlishi.
No, so the answer is, like I said before, right, that it was fluid back in those days. You could read as many verses as you want. And so the fact that, and not just that, you're not limited to the 10 verses. You could read more than 10 verses, right? You can read more than 10 verses, but we're saying no less than 10. So when the first guy got up and he read 4 verses, Rav Papa was happy with that the Kohen read 4 verses. So that's a support to the first example that we brought. It doesn't negate the other examples. It just is a support to the first example. I don't think that, especially since the teaching of Rava to begin with was saying that all of them are praiseworthy if they read an extra verse, right? So we brought a support to the first one, that Rav Papa was happy when the Kohen read 4 verses. But I don't think that prevents the second guy from reading 4 verses. He could also read 4 verses. The only question is, what happens if you do divide it in this way, where you do have 10 verses and the first guy reads 4 verses? Then what about the idea of Mailin Bakodesh Ve'emeridin? What about the fact that you have somebody who already read 4, so why would you go down to 3? That's the question. I don't know the answer to that. It's a good question. Okay.
Rabbi, my question was, who decides that the first one can read 4?
It seems that the reader himself is given the permission to decide if he wants to read 3 or 4 verses. That's what Rav is saying. If the first one reads 4, he's praiseworthy, which means to say you can if you want. Now today it doesn't work that way. Now
I thought the rabbi would decide, but that's what I'm asking.
Right. So it seems that back in those days, right, everybody was a rabbi. It's not like today where you have one rabbi of the congregation. Back then, the rabbi of the congregation was probably a blacksmith or a doctor. Busy all day. It's just that people had a certain respect for him because they knew he knew more than everybody else. But it wasn't the same way that it is today. Okay, moving on. The Gemara says like this: we cannot decrease from them or add to them. Meaning, Yeah, and then we said that the one who opens the reading, which means to say the kohen who gets called up to read first, he makes the opening blessing, right? Baruch Hu Hashem HaMavarach, and then the one who concludes, he says Asher Nasa Lanu Torahs Emes. He says the concluding verse. So Tana taught in the Brisa, elaborating on this to clarify what was stated in the Mishnah. The one who commences the reading says the bracha before the reading, and the one who concludes recites the blessing after the reading. Says the Gemara, the kul who mevarich lefaneh lachareha. But nowadays, that everybody reads a bracha before and the bracha after. So the question we have is, when did that start? Why do we not follow the ruling of the Mishnah that only one bracha is said at the beginning and one bracha is said at the end? Why is it that any guy that gets called up to the Torah today, he makes a bracha before he reads the Torah and a bracha right after his aliyah finishes? So he says, this is the reason that the rabbis instituted this. Gezerah is a decree. It's for the people who come in and leave early. Those who come in late and leave early. What does that mean? It means that if a guy is going to walk in and he sees the guy who gets called up to the Torah, only makes a bracha at the beginning of his blessing, right? And then he walks out before the last guy gets called up, he may assume the first guy who got called up, he read from the Torah, he made a blessing at the beginning, and then he went down and he stopped reading and he didn't make any bracha. So therefore, when I open up my shul now, right, I'm going to tell people, right, all you need to do is just make a bracha at the beginning. We don't make a bracha at the end, because that's what I saw in the shul. So we're worried about people like that. And so therefore, we want to make sure that he sees the kohen who gets called up, makes a bracha before and makes a bracha when he finishes. Likewise, with in case of the people who come late, if a guy who's a Levi gets called up to the Torah, right? A guy walks in and he sees the Levi just start without making a bracha. He goes and opens up his own shul and he says, "I saw in shul, right, that you only make a bracha at the end. There's no bracha at the beginning." So therefore, because we're worried about people who just come in and look at things out of context, we make sure that nobody makes a mistake. You make a bracha at the beginning and you make a bracha at the end. That's why we make those brachas. And that's what we do today. Okay, so now the next discussion is based on the Mishnah says, Rosh Chodoshim, on Rosh Chodesh, and on Chol Hamoed Keren Arba, we call up four people are called up to read from the Torah. So now we're going to get into what I brought up before. Ula Barav asked Rava, Parshas Rosh Chodesh, the portion that we read on Rosh Chodesh, Ketzat Keren Isa. How do we read it? And what does that mean? How do we read it? How do we divide it up? How are we going to divide up the psukim? Okay. So we're going to elaborate on this. Tzaves b'nei Yisrael v'amarta aleim es korbani lachmi, right? The Havya Tamya Psuke. It has 8 verses, right? So let me just share with you again, so we can see what's going on. Okay, remember, you got in Rosh Chodesh, you got 8 verses. The first 8 verses, right? From Vayidaber Hashem al Moshe lema Tzaves b'nei Yisrael, you got 8 verses till Ishay Reich Nechoyach LaHashem. That's 8 verses. Now. Heichi Navid, says the Gemara. So, what are we going to do? Nikre Trey for this portion. If we're going to call up 2 people, then Telasa Psukin. You've got 3 verses per person. That's going to cover 6 of the verses. Okay, that's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and you stop at the end of 6. That would be until Reach Nichoyach LaHashem. That's 6. But Pashaluhu Trey, you're still going to have 2 verses left over from that paragraph, right? You cannot leave over unread from a paragraph less than 3 verses, right? You can't leave over 2. You have to at least have 3. And here you're only going to have 3. So now, Nikre Arba, if you're going to read 4 and 4, you're going to call up 2 people to split up this 8 verses. You're going to have 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 1, 2, 3, 4. That's great. You've covered the first 8 verses. But what you're left with is, scrolling down a minute, you're left with 9, 10, and then 11 to 15. So Pashalu Shiva, you've got now 7 verses left. 7 verses left. How are you going to divide those? So let's just understand. We've covered the first paragraph. Brilliant. We're left with 7. How are we dividing the 7? From Uvayim HaShabbos, how are we going to divide it? Uvayim HaShabbos, Havyan Trey. The paragraph of Uvayim HaShabbos, you've got 2 verses. Uvroshei Chod Sheichem, Havyan Chamisha. And then the next paragraph, right, from 11 till 15, you've got 5 verses, right? So, how are we going to divide it? How are we going to divide them between these 2 readers? Nikre Trei Maha, V'chad Mahanach. Should we have the third guy who's being called up, right? Read 2 verses, right? Vayem HaShabbos till V'niska, right? And then read 1 verse from the 5 verses. You can't do that. Why can't you do that? Here we go over to Daf Chaf Beis Amud Aleph 22a. Why can't you do that? Because ein maschil b'parsha pachas mishloisha psukim. Because you cannot begin a paragraph and read less than 3 verses. So you can't do 9, 10, and 11. We're not going to allow you to do that because you cannot go into the next portion and read less than 3 verses of that next portion. So what are you going to do? Likre trei maha utlas maha. Okay, so let's say you're going to do, one second, Ben. Let me just finish. Yeah. Okay, let's say you're going to do 9, 10, then 11, 12, and 13, because you have to have at least 3 verses. You have to have at least 3 verses from the next paragraph. But the problem is, what's going to happen is, you're only going to have 2 verses left for the last guy, and that's not going to work either. Plus, you can't stop within 3 verses of the end, right? So, if that's the case, how are we going to divide up the Rosh Chodesh reading? Yes, Ben.
Why don't they divide it up into 5, 5, and 5?
Because there are 4
5 and
people.
5. Okay, let's see how. Let's see what you're
Rosh Chodesh.
Let's see what you're suggesting. From verse 1 to verse 5. Okay. Then you're left with 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10.
Right, that's 5.
And then you have the last 5.
Then the last 5. So you have 5, 5.
One second. Ben, you tell me the answer. You tell me the answer. You tell me, based on the Mishnah. Based on the Mishnah. What does the Mishnah say? How many people do we call up on Rosh Chodesh?
3.
On Rosh Chodesh?
Oh, 4. Oh.
So it's not going to work.
No, I was going for 3. That's
right. So your answer is good for 3, but it doesn't work for 4. Okay, so let me stop the share for a minute. And does everybody understand what we said? Right? This is a real problem. How are we going to divide this up? Okay, it's such a good question that Rava says to him, "Amalai." So Rava said to Ula, "Zu lai shamaiti." I didn't hear a ruling with regards to how to divide up the Rosh Chodesh reading. It's a problem, right? What do we do? However, Kayetziba Shamaiti, I did hear a ruling on a question similar to this one. I want to say something over here, and this is important. It is very good to have brains. It's excellent to have brains. However, brains without humility is a problem. Okay? Humility is when a person wants to come along and share something as sacred as a halacha, a ruling on what we're supposed to do. Meaning to say, what does Hashem want from me? To do this without having heard this from your teacher, that's an act of arrogance, okay? And you can have all the brains in the world, right? But if you could come along and start to make a ruling because it makes sense to you without quoting a source, then it's a problem. And Rava is the one who demonstrates this to us right over here. He said, I didn't hear a ruling with regards to Rosh Chodesh, right? In other words, I don't have in my tradition, right, how you're supposed to split up Rosh Chodesh. However, I have heard something similar where we have a similar problem, and based on the rulings that come out from that ruling, then we could learn out what the ruling would be over here. Okay? Okay, and this is what Rabbanim, who are worth their salt, do every day in their practice, which means to say there are questions that keep coming up for Rabbanim day in and day out, where they have to answer questions that not necessarily were dealt with by previous generations. But you can't just come along and say, well, I'll just use my brains. You have to go and you have to find a source where you can derive from there the basic principles from which you want to take and now apply in the case that you want to rule. Okay, that's just an aside, but an important aside. Okay, so let's do it inside. So what's the story? The Tanan learned in a Mishnah by Yom HaRishon, on the first day, Bereshis, you read from Bereshis, and then Vayhi Rakia, and let there be a firmament. What's going on? Okay, so when it comes to the offering up of the sacrifices, there were the Kohanim and the Leviim that were doing their job, and then there were Israelites, Israelim, who were there as representatives of the rest of the Klal Yisrael. They were supposed to be standing there, and there were 24 shifts of people who were supposed to be standing there at the time when the sacrifices were being offered. And what were they doing? So they were reading. They would read from the Torah. What would they read from the Torah? They would read from Bereshis. This is in the Gemara Titus, but it's also brought at the end of Megilla. So I just want to share something over here as follows. Okay. Till now, I was sharing with you Rosh Chodesh. Now we're going to look at Bereshis. Okay, the same idea. You want to call up at least how many? You want to call up 3 people, right? So now, the way they would divide the reading of the Torah is on the first day they would read Bereshis, meaning they would read for the first day by the second day they would read for the second day, and so on. Each day they would read for that day. It's explained. One of the reason is because the sacrifices and the Jewish people doing what Hashem wants and being forgiven for their sins, etc., is really what holds up the whole existence of the universe. So therefore, every day we read about the creation of the universe. Okay, so now the question is, how do we divide it up? Okay, how do we divide it up? Let's look how many psukim we have. Bereshis, right? So 2, 3, 4, 5. You got 5 verses. Okay, you got 5 verses. So you're not gonna just do 5 verses. So what you're gonna have to do is you're gonna have to go into the next portion and read a few more verses. So let's see what it says. So let's go to the Gemara. And we ask, it's understanding that the section of let there be a firmament is read by one person, right? The Tlasa Psukahava, because there are 3 verses. Ela Bereshis Bishnayim. But how is it that the Bereshis Bar Alekim is going to be read by 2 people? How do you read? 1 second. Okay, let me go back. Let's go back. I'm sorry. Let me go back to the Mishnah. When I say the Mishnah, meaning the Tanan. A few lines back. The Tanan we learned in the Mishnah, by Yom HaRishon on the first day, Bereshis v'Yehi Rakia. They would read the portion of Bereshis and Yehi Rakia. V'Tani Allah, and the Baraisa taught with regarding to this, right? Bereshis b'Shnayim. The first paragraph, Bereshis, was divided and read by 2 people. Yehi Rakia be'echad, and the second paragraph, Yehi Rakia, was read by 1 person. And we question this. It's understood why. The portion of Yehi Rakia can be read by 1 person, because at the end of the day, the tlasa psukava there, because there are 3 verses in the paragraph. Ela b'reishis b'shnayim. But how could you say that you're going to split Bereish, the first paragraph of Bereishis bara Elikim till Vayi'er Vayivoke Yem Echad into 2? Because Chamisha Psukava, there are only 5 verses. Vitanya, and it was taught in the Brisa, Hakoyer Batera, somebody who reads from the Torah, Le'yivches Mishleisha Psukim, should not read less than 3 Psukim. Ve'itma Allah. And it was said, in answer to this, Rav Omar Doleg. Rav says that the second reader skips. What does that mean? It means he goes back and he rereads the last verse that the first reader read. So what that means is that the first guy says Bereishis bara Elikim until Vayem Elikim Yehi'ar Vayi'ar. Okay, that's where he stops. The second guy who gets called up, instead of just reading 4 and 5, he reads 3, 4, 5. So he goes back and he says Vayem Elikim Yehi'ar Vayi'ar and keeps on going Vayar Elikim SR Kitov until Vayar Vayivoke Yem Echad. And that's how you'll divide them up. So that's the opinion of Rav. That's how he deals with this problem. Again, Rav is bringing this to be able to learn from here what we should do on Rosh Chodesh. So he's bringing what Rav says, and now he tells us what Shmuel says. Shmuel doesn't agree with Rav. Shmuel Amar Paisek. He says that what you should do is the first guy should split the 3rd verse. So it means he'll read 2.5 verses, which will be considered to him as his 3 verses, right? And the second guy should read the second half of that verse, meaning splitting it, and he'll be reading 2.5 verses, which will be considered to him as if he read 3 verses. And that's how he resolved it. So let's do this inside.
But Rabbi, that's not going to solve the problem. They still need 10, not 9. At the end of number 8, they need 10.
What we're gonna say is, right? Just 1 second. You've got 1 second. You've got 1, 2, 3, and then we're gonna have 3, 4, 5. Not because he's reading the whole thing again, but because he's reading half. And okay, so you're saying even after you read all of that, right? You're still left with 9 psukim and not 10 psukim.
Right.
So possibly we'll have to say, it's a good question. But possibly we could answer and say that when we said it's no less than 10, that's in the synagogue. Here, what we're talking about right now, in this particular instance, is how it was done by the Ma'amodos, the people who would come to stand in the Beis Hamikdash when they were bringing the sacrifices. And maybe there, it was okay to read less than 10 because it's not official Kriyas HaTorah. It's not Monday or Thursday or Shabbos. It's something that they did Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And so it's possible it's not the same as the Kriyas HaTorah, right? It's slightly different, okay?
Okay.
But so we have over here 2 opinions. We've got Rav's opinion and Shmuel's opinion. Rav is you read 1, 2, 3, then 3, 4, 5. And Shmuel's opinion is you read 1, 2.5, half, 4, and 5. Okay, that's how he works it out. So now the Gemara analyzes this dispute. Okay, let me close this for a second. Okay,
Rabbi, I have a question.
Yeah.
I know that when I'm reading Rashi, it basically says to add that, but doleg, doesn't that normally mean to skip?
That's correct.
So how can something that we use nowadays to mean to skip, in the old days used to mean to add?
Because it has 2 connotations. It has 2 connotations. If we go back to the first chapter, the second chapter, there was a similar instance where there's a word that can be understood differently. Like I think it was beserugin, right? What's it? Maybe it's in the first chapter. The point is that there was a discussion of when a person reads it, he starts and he stops, he starts and he stops. And there he calls it sirugin, but that's not usually the way we understand sirugin today. But nevertheless, that's there were two ways it was understood back in those days, and it seems that the dilug over here is understood in this way, that dilug means to jump, right? But it means over here to jump back. It doesn't mean necessarily to skip a verse, but it means to jump back. Anyway,
The Serugin, they were talking about half bricks, that there were spaces in between.
no, that was something else. That was something else.
There was something else.
That was something else. Yeah, that was Levena, like a half a brick and a half a brick.
Yeah.
Okay. Moving. Okay, so let's move on with the analysis of Rav's opinion and Shmuel's opinion. Rav Amar Doilek. Rav said that you go back and you read 1, 2, 3, and then 3, 4, 5. So the question is, Malay Amar Paisek, why does he not say like Shmuel to split in the middle of the verse? So the Gemara explains, Kosava, Rav holds, Kol Psuka, Delay Psake Moshe, any verse that was not split by Moshe, Anan le paskinan le. We don't divide it. We don't split a verse. If Moshe Rabbeinu didn't split the verse, we don't split the verse when we're reading from the Torah. Okay. Or Shmuel Amar paskinan le. Shmuel says we do divide, right? So Amar Reb Chanina, but Reb Chanina, who was an expert, right? He was called Reb Chananya. His name was Reb Chananya Korah. That's his name, Chananya Korah. So he was a scriptural expert, right? And so he tells over that Tsar Godel Hoyali Eitzel Reb Chanina Hagodel. I took great pains that Reb Chanina Hagodel should permit me to divide a verse into, because he was trying to teach children. And in order to teach the children, he found that it was going to be too difficult for them to have to memorize and to read 3 verses. He wanted to split a verse into 2. And he did not permit me to divide any verse except for the school children who find it difficult to master an entire verse at once. So he allowed me to split the verse. But what we see from this, right? Because the verses are made into several parts to be taught more easily. So therefore, what we see from this story is that Reb Chananya worked really hard to try and get a heter from Reb Chanina, and Reb Chanina would not give him any permission to split a verse, except for when it comes to teaching children. So therefore, how could Shmuel come along and so nonchalantly just say, yeah, we just divide a verse? How can you just divide a verse? So the Gemara answers, have some time in mind. What's the reason that Reb Chanina gave Reb Chananya Kra a heter, meaning permission to divide it? What was the reason? Because it's impossible to teach the children any other way. So the Gemara is saying that what Shmuel will say to you is, over here it's also impossible. We can't divide Bereshis any other way, right? The only way to do it is to split the verses. In other words, he doesn't like this idea of skipping. We're going to go a little bit further into looking at the reasons why he doesn't like the skipping. But the point here is that he feels that there is no other alternative. And so just like Reb Chanina permitted Reb Chananya to split it for the children when there's no other way for them to learn, so too he's of the opinion that we would be allowed to split the verse when there's no other options. So the Gemara says, one second, Shmuel, who says that one splits it into 2. So my time, why doesn't he say like Rav that you just go back and read another verse? Why are you telling me that there's no other way, but apart from splitting the verse, why can't you just do what Rav says and go back? So the Gemara answers, because he's very worried about the people who come in late and leave early. What are they going to see? If they see somebody, right, starting, let's say you have Bereshis bara Elokim, Eis Hashemayim ve'Eis Haaretz, right? You read the first, the second, and the third, and then I walk into shul and I see a guy reading 3, 4, 5. So I make a very quick calculation and I say, the first guy only read 2 psukim, right? Because I see this guy reading 3, 4, 5. When I open up my shul, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to say you can call a guy for less than 3 psukim, because I'm assuming that if this guy's reading 3, 4, 5, the guy before him read 1 and 2. So because Shmuel's worried about the people who come in late and leave early, so therefore he said it's better not to go back. It's better to split it. Okay, so Frank the Gemara. Meisvei, the challenge that I'm ruling from a brisa. It says in the brisa,
say you can lane half a pasuk.
Huh?
People who come in are going to say you can lane half a pasuk.
So his view is that you can. According to Shmuel, that's not a problem. According to Shmuel, when you are stuck, that's a legitimate solution. We don't pascha like that, but that's his suggestion. Okay, so Meisvei ask a challenge from a brisa. It says a paragraph of 6 verses is divided by and read by 2 people. A paragraph of 5 verses is read by one person. If the first reader already read 3 verses of a 5-verse paragraph, so then what do you do? It's it. He finished. He went down. Next guy gets called up. What's he supposed to do? So Hasheni, we say Hasheni koresh nayim miparsha zu v'echad miparsha acheres, and this. So he reads 2 verses that remain from this paragraph and 1 from the next paragraph. And some say that you should read not just 1 verse from the next section, but 3 verses from the next section. Why? Because one cannot begin a paragraph and read less than 3 verses. So now, explaining what the objection is. If we're going to say that you can do as Rav and Shmuel said above, according to the one Rav who says that you can go back, why do you have to come along and say that only one person could read 5? Or he should read 3, and or if in the case where he read 3 and the next guy only has 2, we have a whole question about what he should do. According to you, why doesn't the Brisa just say go back? It's a simple solution. Why doesn't the Brisa take your solution? And according to you, Shmuel, who says that we split it, why doesn't the Brisa make your suggestion? In other words, Rav and Shmuel are Amoraim, right? They're from the time of the Gemara. A Brisa is from the time of the Tanaim. So now, Rav and Shmuel, you're coming along and you're making a suggestion that what you should do in the case of Bereshis, right, at least, is that you should go back and either split the verse or go back and read the verse again. So in this Brisa that we're quoting, right, why didn't they use either of your solutions? Why didn't they come along and say go back, or say that you could split it? And for the Gemara says shiny hosam, it's different over there in the Brisa, the Efsher Bahachi, because it's possible to continue reading from the next paragraph. So therefore, you don't need to resort to Rav and Shmuel. Rav and Shmuel are talking about Bereshis. Bereshis, when it comes to the Mamodes. The Mamodes were that you would read the first and the second of the readings, and that's it. So now there's no option to go and start reading on the 3rd day. So the question is, we're giving you this to work with, right? We're giving you the first 2 paragraphs of Bereshis to work with. You figure out how to divide it. We're not telling you you can have the option to go and read further. Whereas the Brisa is not talking about the Mamodos, it's talking about in general Kriyas Torah, where there is more flexibility. When you have more flexibility, then Rav and Shmuel would agree that you don't have to split it and you don't have to go back and read it. It's only when there's no flexibility. So Amar Reb Tamcho, just a remark on this Brisa that we mentioned. Amar Reb Tamcho, Amar Reb Yishuv ben Levi, halacha ki yesh omrim. That the halacha follows the one the yesh omrim. And what was the yesh omrim? The yesh omrim were the ones that says that you have to at least read 3 psukim of the next paragraph, because you cannot read less than 3 psukim. Okay, and I think it's good to stop over here. and we'll pick up Emes Hashem on Sunday. But just let me summarize quickly what we've said. We've said as follows. We have a question. How do you divide up Rosh Chodesh because of the ways the paragraphs appear? And we've said we don't have a clear tradition and ruling with regards to Rosh Chodesh, but we're going to go and look at a similar problem that exists with the Maimonides, where they would read from Bereshis, and we have two opinions. We have Rav and Shmuel, how you resolve it. One says you go back a pasuk, one says you split the verse, and we raised an objection from a Brisa, but we said that that's not a legitimate objection because there is talking about a place where there's flexibility. Bereshis is talking about where there's no flexibility, and I'll just add that in Rosh Chodesh there's no flexibility either. I mean, the reason why there's no flexibility on Rosh Chodesh either is because the next section has nothing to do with the reading of the day. The first section, which talks about the daily sacrifice, is related to Rosh Chodesh because, like every other day, you bring up the Korban Tamid. Shabbos is related to it because there's many times that Rosh Chodesh falls out on Shabbos, and Rosh Chodesh is related to it obviously because it's Rosh Chodesh. But to go in and to go further and read extra verses from Pesach, Pesach's got nothing to do with Rosh Chodesh. And we'll stop over there. I wish you all a wonderful Shabbos.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Isaac, feel better than you, wife.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Rabbi.
This is like all practical halacha. The stuff will